in historical terms, just to give some kind of context, I think that the key word to Dada is anger. And something I've come to understand about Dada is that it was part of a wave of feeling and a wave of culture that followed World War I. And it's so much a part of our world, of the late 20th century, the early 21st century, that I almost think we don't notice the influence of Dada because it's so prevalent in some of the kinds of humor, sarcasm, political art, collage that we still have now. It really became embedded in our culture. But it was a direct disappointment, a direct reaction from artists who evaded and survived World War I. And talking about the word survived, I'm just going to say briefly, the rough death toll for World War I was 20 million. And another 20 million died of the Spanish flu. These rough estimates in the wave of illness after World War I. And, thinking about COVID, my grandfather's college roommate, and my grandfather graduated in 1919, died 3 months after graduation from Spanish flu. So, feel the cycle of these things coming around again. What Dada mainly did, and Dada had different centers. It had centers in Germany and in Switzerland and even in Italy. But Dada art had a mindset where it allowed artists and other creatives to be crazy. And in particular, it allowed them to be crazy, often in a childlike kind of way. And it was this reverse calculus. The world has gone crazy. That's what the war had showed people. So Dada wanted to be another kind of crazy, kind of a flip side crazy that was creative and disorderly, hopefully in a more harmless way than the real world of craziness in politics. And the core value, one of the things that stoked the anger of this generation, was this incredible feeling that they had been lied to by the people in power. And ironically, one of the things that really spurred, I'm going to say, the environment surrounding World War I and Dada was the growth in literacy. The growth in literacy in Europe in the 18th and 19th century had been tremendous. And we think of literacy as being a good thing. It's not always a good thing because, for example, in a city like Paris, it's estimated that there was 90% literacy by the end of the 19th century, which was phenomenal. In the countryside, it was something more like 10% of women were literate and 20% of men were literate. The rates were still much lower. But in the cities, people had become consumers of magazines, of newspapers. The construction sites were littered with billboards and placards. Printed material was everywhere, and more people were reading, and the written word had a tremendous authority because of the newness of literacy and the spread of literacy. But that was ripe ground for, you guessed it, deception and lying. And this is not from Robert Hughes. This is from when I was driving to work one morning. The college where I taught was near an Indian casino. And actually, on a day where I actually was teaching about Dada, I stopped, I pulled the car over, and I took this with my smartphone, and I took off the name of the Indian casino. But it just struck me as, this is the extent to which lying has been embraced and embedded in our culture. So this ad, it was an ad for a casino, handful of $100 bills with the slogan, "We want you to win." And that just stopped my car because I thought, oh, that's exactly 100% wrong. I mean, that's the exact opposite of what the people running the casino actually want. They want you to lose, but they tell you, "We want you to win." And I don't need to really go off the rails and say, here we are in an age of disinformation and flipped truths and all those things. I think we're all living it. But back in the beginning of the 19th century with literacy, another kind of lying and disinformation was showing its head for the first time. And this, of course, can be related to the recruitment posters for World War I. And like a lot of college-educated people, which I'm sure most of you are, I'm not entirely sure what World War I was about. I mean, I know the Archduke of Sarajevo was assassinated. I know that there was political decline and kind of a political rot, the end of the Habsburg Empire. I mean, all of that. But it maybe didn't have a kind of a central evil like World War II, the focus on Nazism. But whatever World War I was about, young men were recruited in patriotic terms. And you can see here, this is a British poster, take up the sword of justice. And what young man looking at that poster would say, oh no, I'd rather slink away, and I'd rather take up the, I'd rather take up cowardice. And, in my own family, my grandfather, my British grandfather, joined the Canadian Army at 17 against his parents' wishes, because he was like the men of his generation. He was so anxious to be part of this great war. And in his case, he was gassed at the Second Battle of Ypres and his lungs never recovered. And that's, a context of my family. But this, massive war was sold this way with images of patriotism and justice. And of course, the reality of the war was unimaginable, because we talked about this in Mechanical Paradise. We talked about the fact that extraordinary new inventions were transforming warfare. And maybe to just give one kind of an image to help understand World War I, many of the commanders were elderly, especially on the German side. And soldiers often went into battle in ordered, formations, and were cut down by machine guns, because there wasn't yet, the realization about, how machine guns were going to affect warfare. I mean, that came pretty quickly. But when you look at that list, poison gas, the machine gun, aerial warfare, I mean, just aerial warfare, just that is enough to transform war. Trenches, tanks, mines, barbed wire. And of course, what really happened was a form of mass mechanized death. And for those who didn't die, their minds were forever wounded. And I'm going to show you a 1-minute video, which is, it's very hard to watch and it's very peculiar, but it's not one of the most disturbing videos out there. Before we came up with the term PTSD, people used to say shell-shocked. And this is an image of a World War I soldier who was shell-shocked and who was not able to stand up or find his balance as a result. And then later, I don't know how, but the end of the video shows him treated. But I want to show this as a context for Dada. If I can make that run. So I have to say this, anybody who's familiar with Monty Python, I think you're seeing the deep origins of the Ministry of Silly Walks back in World War I. And again, that was actually a fairly mild case of shell shock compared to some of the videos you can find on YouTube. But men were destroyed in their bodies and destroyed in their minds. It was impossible, maybe to understand or to comprehend what was happening. So many young people did what they felt they had to do, which is they evaded the war. They left. They didn't follow the directives of the posters. And this was, the kind of the beginnings of Dada. A number of them ended up in Zurich, Switzerland, at a place called the Cabaret Voltaire. And that was one of the places that Dada germinated. And Dada was not just visual art. Dada was performance. Dada was literature, made its way into visual art. And again, it was this kind of odd, playful, rebellious, elite in a way, madness. And now as a kind of a counterpoint to, and I want to say one more thing about it. The speech, say that Hugo Ball is giving there, that you see him waving the French flag, it's gibberish. because one of the core ideas of Dada was that language had been polluted, the official language, the language of politics, the language of power. So everything about Dada, even the language, was sort of nuts. And I'm going to show you a little snippet of some actual performance at the Cabaret Voltaire, and you'll get the feeling of the Dada atmosphere.
Im Februar 1916 gründete Hugo Ball in der Spiegelgasse 1 das Cabaret Voltaire, aus dem Dada entstand. Also Ball war der eigentliche Gründer der Dada-Bewegung. Es kamen auch tatsächlich 3 junge Männer. Der eine war Christian Zara, der andere Marcel Janko und ein dritter Herr, dessen Namen er sich nicht mehr erinnerte, und boten ihre Dienste an. Hans Arp war auch da für die Dekoration. Emmy Henning sang mit ihrer etwas brüchigen, aber sehr überzeugenden kleinen Stimme. Alk spielte Klavier und das Kabarett startete.
Anyways, that goes on for about 5 minutes. But another thing, can you imagine the Marx Brothers without Dada? I think so much humor came out of the satire of Dada. Well, it was mentioned in that video that someone who did the decoration for the Cabaret Voltaire was the artist Hans Arp. And I want to show you some of his work because he built from that principle of language being polluted, and also of adulthood somehow being a deranged state of mind. So he built an artwork that really went back to being childlike. He decided that for an image of innocence, you only had to go to the child. And he once said that he felt that the way a work of art should make you feel is you should feel like a child opening a new toy. And you should feel that sense of purity and excitement and joy about this item. He also made works of art that were about randomness. And these collages that you see here were made by him tearing up small pieces of paper and then putting a cardboard or another piece of paper on the floor. He'd let them randomly drift down, and then he would glue them in place. And of course, what he wanted to say was that there was a randomness to life and there was a randomness to fate, but he had found an aesthetic way of depicting that. And it's more explicit when you look at this relief he did 3 years after the war in 2022, and you can roughly make out kind of humanoid figures. You see soldiers marching, if you will, in formation. And one of the things Dada liked to make fun of was the idea of order, the idea of regimentation. But when you look at this very, very simple image, kind of like a child's puzzle or a modular kind of illustration, you can see that the soldiers in some way are different from each other. Some might have a green head, some might have a yellow head. They have a kind of an orb, which might represent their heart or their spirit. And you can see one soldier has one that's dark while the others are light. And in this very, very childlike way, Arp is talking about life and death. He is asking who lives and who dies, and what's the randomness of that. And to get the feeling of this work of art, you have to imagine explaining to a very, very young child why someone died, or why is there war, or why do disturbing things happen, and how do adults explain that to children? That's really where Arp was coming from. And of course, his art had a tremendous heart of absurdity, as did much Dada art. And just the title of this piece is absurd. Birds in an aquarium. Well, we all know that, you put birds in an aquarium, they drown because they belong in the sky, and fish should be in the aquarium, although maybe they should actually be in the ocean when you really think about that, or in a lake. So again, it's a kind of a childlike observation about what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with this picture that, this playful image reminds us of death, reminds us that young men were sent to war. Why should young men be sent to war? He asked that question. Another Dadaist, a German Dadaist, was Kurt Schwitters. And he really honed in on the idea of language, especially printed language, being corrupt. And the way he handled that was he began making collages that he called Mers collages. And I'll tell you the source of that word later. But in the Mers collages, he took, this kind of wealth of modern printed material. He took a 1 mark note, he took playbills, he took cigarette wrappers, he took tram tickets, tobacco labels, anything he could find, also store advertisements. And he collaged them together in a kind of absurd reordering. And he wanted his art to be, I'm going to say, the opposite of what society had become in the Weimar Republic. I think one of the values he had was that it was absurd to go back to thinking about fashion or theater or the pleasures of middle-class life when so many lives had been lost or shattered or destroyed. And his reordering of that was a way of kind of taking control and creating a new disorder that was the counterpart to the official order. So in collage, they also expanded the idea of collage in pieces like that if it were a Robert Rauschenberg, I'd call this a combine. I'm not sure what the art historians call this one, but it's Portrait of a Noble Lady. And among the things you can see embedded in this great piece, this kind of combined piece, you can see a broken wheel, like a tricycle wheel. You see a sort of a rotor that might have come from a large lawnmower. You see metal plates, rods. I think there's actually some concrete in here somewhere. There's a broken wheel. So you really have junkyard, cast off kind of products. And all of those things really play off of the title, Portrait of a Noble Lady. And you have to ask yourself, where's the nobility and where's the lady? And to make this piece come alive, I mentioned Robert Rauschenberg because the American Robert Rauschenberg really drew from Schwitters, really was admiring of Schwitters. So I'll tell you a Rauschenberg story that puts this in context. Years later in the 1950s, Robert Rauschenberg showed a piece. It's a very famous piece now called Canyon that has a taxidermied bird in the middle of it. And he was showing this at an opening, and an older woman came up to him and really let him know how much she hated the piece. And she went into a lot of detail about how ugly it was, how you shouldn't have a taxidermied animal in the museum, how she thought it was repellent, how she was, angry. He made this work, and he kind of stood there and listened and let her have at it. And when she was done, he looked at her, he said, "Ma'am," he said, "with all due respect, I find it offensive that you're wearing a dead animal around your neck." And of course, she was wearing a mink stole. So it's that kind of situation of whose values are the right values and whose values are the wrong values when you face off with each other, when you turn the tables. And that's Kurt Schwitters. He's holding up garbage to a society and saying, this is who you are. And your aristocracy, which of course, I'll put that in air quotes, is, your destruction and your industrial products and the things that, really are not beautiful or noble. His ultimate work, by the way, I want to explain Mers to you. Mers there's a German word, Kommers, which means commerce. And that's what he was satirizing. And so he made these Mers collages, but he also, at the end of his life, starting in 1923, worked on what you and I would call an installation, this kind of massive construction that went on inside his apartment in Hanover. And he worked on it till 1937. And he called it the Meersbau. So we'll call it the house of commercial trash. And there are some photos that survive of it from 1933. but you want to understand it was something that was always changing. He'd get up in the morning, what I want to add to, what I want to change today. And it has a lot of details you can't see at this point. There was a lot of lettering in it. There were small collage elements taken from newspapers and playbills. There were doll heads, all these things going on. And it actually was recreated by MoMA for an exhibition at one point. So there's a recreation of the Meeresbau. And in kind of an ultimate irony, the Meeresbau was destroyed by Allied bombers in 1943. So the work of art generated by the rage about society after World War I was then destroyed in the next war. I don't know if there's a metaphor in that, but something to think about. Marcel Duchamp, who I think most of you know for his ready-mades, also had some early roots in Dada, also dealt with language and dealt with the absurdity of culture in his own way. And one of his most explosive and famous pieces is, if you were to see it in person, it's really just kind of an art world baseball card. It's a printed postcard. I imagine maybe he bought it at the Mona Lisa or somebody, or simply at the Louvre, or someone gave it to him. But it's simply a commercial printed postcard of the Mona Lisa. So I guess in that sense, it's a ready-made because it was a mass-produced item. And he took that small postcard, and like a teenager with a wry sense of humor, he added the mustache and the goatee. And at the bottom, he added 5 letters. And I have enough high school French that this kind of makes sense to me. If you say those letters, if you phoneticize them, you say them in French, it's LHOQ, which means she has a hot ass. So it's very, very adolescent, and Dada is very, very adolescent, but it's also a prank on culture. And the prank on culture flips everything, like Schwitters flips everything, and it makes you ask a lot of questions. How could European culture be so great when it created these wars? That's one leading question. Is Leonardo da Vinci, this great master whose masterwork is the heart of French museums, is it as great as we're taught to believe it is? And then very, very wryly, it also kind of puts out the idea that the Mona Lisa was Leonardo in drag. It makes a reference to his homosexuality. It sort of outs him. It does all these things that you might see in a postmodern work of art. But disrespectful, that's Dada. So Berlin in the Weimar period and after was a real center of Dada. But it's worth pointing out, when you look into Dada more, some of the young German artists, some of the artists we call expressionists, like Ernst Kirchner, had worked in Dresden. They had worked in other cities, but there was a new kind of a center of Dadaism in the Weimar Republic in Berlin. So there are some expressionists that cross the line to making Dada works of art. George Grosz is one of them. And the main theme of German Dada was that the artists hated and were disgusted with other Germans in a very, very powerful and a very corrosive way. So Kirchner, for example, you probably would call this an expressionist painting, but it's still worth looking at. Kirchner was drafted for World War I, and he actually made this painting, well, when he got his draft notice, but he hadn't served yet. But in his imagination, he painted his uniform, and he painted Erna, his common law wife, behind him. And in his imagination, he felt like he already had lost a part of his body. You can see he holds up the stump of his hand, which he never really did, lose his hand. And but it was like saying, I know just by being drafted, I know that this war is going to maim my body and is going to shatter me. And I believe that Kirchner did some military service and had then an enormous nervous breakdown, which actually was kind of the normal response to doing military service. I know, for example, for Max Beckmann, another painter, Max Beckmann did service in the ambulance corps for 6 months and then had a massive nervous breakdown in response to what he had seen. Max Ernst, who we often think of as a surrealist, made a photo montage that really raised disturbing ideas about technology. In Mechanical Paradise, we talked about the excitement of man-powered, excuse me, not man-powered, but powered flight, and, you know, the Wright brothers and all of the excitement that brought into the world. Ernst, after the war, made this very, very strange collage to talk about the power of aviation to murder. And you can see it has parts of an airplane, but it also has human arms that are making a kind of a ironically graceful gesture, like a form of ballet. And as the murdering airplane flies through the collage, a wounded serviceman is carried away in the corner. And when I showed this at community college a few years ago, I actually had a student whose father had been in the Air Force in Las Vegas and had flown drones in Afghanistan, you know, from Las Vegas. And she commented on how, you know, her father did this, you know, aviation. He took people's lives remotely from thousands of miles away. And it's the kind of the, you know, outcome of what Max Ernst suggested with this image. So Dada had a vogue. It was a, you know, like punk or something. It had its followers, and they had their get-togethers. In this particular early Dada gathering, you can see that at the top of the ceiling, there is a stuffed mannequin of a German general with the head of a pig, and a placard, I'm sure a nasty placard, hanging from the jacket. And all around the room, there are Dada slogans, which if you read German, they're nonsense. They're kind of political posters that try to tell you to do things, but the, you know, what it tells you to do makes no sense, because that's the essence of Dada. There's a saying I like about human nature, that people tend to become what they hate. And you see that in Dada. You see that in hating the official German culture, they became, you know, this kind of opposite, yet very, very organized and very politicized opposite. Otto Dix, I think he showed in some of the exhibitions, made this very searing image that has collage elements, card-playing war cripples. And you can see that there's a real disconnect from the way that the veterans feel about themselves towards what Otto Dix is seeing. And they are horribly maimed. I mean, one has his earpiece on the table, the tiny little gramophone, it looks like, with a tube going to the side of his skull where his skin has been blown off. The one in the center has a metal jaw in which he holds a card. Most of them are legless. You can see their peg legs beneath the table. And they are, how do I say it, the proud veterans of the war. And Dix looks at them and sees he sees both victims and perpetrators in the veterans. Raoul Haussmann, who was a collagist, also worked in sculpture. And this he made from a mannequin head. I guess in the early days, mannequins could have been made out of mahogany. They were made out of wood. And he called it the spirit of our time. And you can see that it has a kind of a funnel that leads into the head, which I assume makes it easy to stuff propaganda in there. It has a metal plate, maybe the result of surgery, or maybe another place you could insert intelligence. It has a kind of a measuring tool bolted to the side, and a hammerhead, a rubber hammerhead on the other side. And what Haussmann thought about Germans, about his fellow Germans, was very, very searing. He said, the ordinary German has no more capabilities than those with which chance has glued on the outside of his skull. His brain remains empty. So in Haussmann's collages, he came up with this kind of I'll call it the war room of Dada, the place where Dada artists could have their own politics, you know, their own cultural war, their own attempt to reorder German society. And you can see there's a typewriter where maybe the propaganda could be written. In fact, it looks a little bit like the self-portrait of Haussmann is dictating in the lower part of the picture. There is a human body. There's a view of Berlin. There's a kind of a Mercator projection, you know, a schematic of the whole world with Dada printed onto it. Up in the upper right, Dada siegt. It's the siege of Dada, and they are planning this new, deranged, crazy, childlike, sarcastic culture that, you know, any culture would be better than the culture of the German Republic and of the Weimar Republic. And literally, he has Dada on his mind. But I think the more powerful artist was Hausmann's longtime girlfriend. I don't know that they were ever married. Maybe she was a common law wife, but the really powerful artist in the family was Hannah Höch. And you can see that she used collage as a weapon. I don't know how in any other way to put it. In The Beautiful Girl, she attacks the idea of beauty, of the male gaze, and does something I think Picasso would have appreciated, uses a shrunken head as the head of this beautiful girl. And one thing I want you to notice, when you look at the spectacles that have been collaged on that shrunken head, one eye is upside down and one eye is right side up, because the derangement of the senses is a Dada theme. And in one of her greatest works, you see a kind of a feminist remaking of the whole culture, and also a great satire. And this collage is called, has a very long title, Cut with the Kitchen Knife Through the Last Epoch of Weimar Beer Belly Culture in Germany. And to understand it, full of recognizable people and details, I want to give you some screenshots. And as I do this, I'd like to give some credit. If you'd like to learn about this work of art, Google Smart History. And Smart History has videos up on YouTube that walk you through works of art with a conversation. They're fantastic. And these screen shares are from Smart History. So in the upper right of the image, it's kind of what we call the anti-Dada area of the collage. You see Kaiser Wilhelm, and you notice that he has a baby floating in front of one of his eyes as kind of maybe a moral statement, and then two wrestlers wrestling under his nose to compose his mustache. And in the center, standing on the head of a headless figure, there must be a comment in that, are Lenin and some communists, some German leaders. Germany's politics, by the way, when this was made in 1919, were head to head, the right wing versus the left wing. Interestingly, at the very, very center of the collage is Käthe Kollwitz, the German expressionist artist who was a friend of Hannah Höch, and her head is being juggled by a well-known dancer. Albert Einstein is there, and in German, in a little strip below this, he gives some advice. Hey, young man, Dada is not an art trend. He kind of warns you about Dada because, of course, he's a scientist. He's very rational. But many of the male figures are infantilized, and one that should make you laugh, the body of a baby has been added to the backwards head of an art critic who had some damaging things to say about Dada. Down here at the bottom, we have a German communist leader exhorting people, join Dada. And finally, if you're wondering, where's the artist herself? She shows up in a small head that's actually pasted to a map, and the map, the countries you see in black, those are the countries in Europe where women were allowed to vote. So there's a feminist statement in her reordering of Weimar culture. When you look at this image by George Grosz, you can see this man, and maybe this industrial worker in a white lab coat, maybe a scientist, as a kind of a victim. I don't know if you notice the detail that there's a barber's knife that's about to slice his head off. And when his head is sliced off, this kind of rubber hammer will move it to the side, maybe to a conveyor belt. There's a big question mark bolted to his skull. One eye is upside down and deranged. His nose is a spark plug, and even his mouth is not his own. So another very, very damning image of Germans in the era of Dada. If you loved Mad Magazine, I think you're going to love the work of George Soles, who made this image of an industrial farmer and his family. And let me walk you through it. But just starting with the main image, you can see that this industrial farmer is a good Christian holding his Bible with the golden cross. His wife is a kind of a satire on the Madonna and Child, holding a baby pig, and their son is an empty-headed, really kind of a monster who is compared to a reptile and whose tongue shoots out to trap a frog. We'll give you some details. You have to say for the wife, at least she has her head screwed on. You can say that about her. But, just searing caricatures. The Kaiser in the background, and a couple of mark notes coming out of the man's head. At least he's, making some good money. He clearly has a venereal disease. You can see that in the deformations of his face, and a really grim detail. If you look at the wife's fingernails, you notice that she has a fungus infection that are making black stripes on her nails. So the artist didn't miss anything in terms of condemning this family. I think something, my students always wondered is what happened to Dada during the rise of Hitler? And the answer is, well, of course, many of the Dada artists, the ones that were still in Germany, used photo montage to warn people about Hitler. And here, John Hartfield, who had been a friend of Hannah Höch, made this kind of astonishing collage. Adolf the Superman, he swallows gold and spouts junk. And you can see his heart is a swastika. And then very, very grimly, he also made this collage with the slogan, "As in the Middle Ages, so in the Third Reich." And he showed the swastika as a kind of a brace for crucifixion. And all of this was before, this is in the late 1930s. I think you also may have heard of this, but if you haven't, you can go on YouTube and you can watch the documentary Degenerate Art. But Hitler, who was a failed artist, made or ordered a huge exhibition that mocked modern art, and it was called Degenerate Art. And interestingly, the Degenerate Art exhibit used Dada strategies. It had, slogans on the wall, and works were hung upside down. There actually were placards at the Degenerate Art Show that encouraged the viewers to spit on the works of art. But some of this, oddly enough, had been borrowed from Dada, which of course was, the enemy of everything that Nazism stood for. All right, moving to Italy for a minute. Let's talk about the rise of fascism, because I promised to say a few things about fascist architecture today. I think many of you know the history, but just a brief take on this. You want to remember that there was fascism in Germany, Italy, and Spain. The shattered economies left after World War I left a fertile ground for this, and paternalistic dictatorships of one form or another took root in those countries. And I think the core value of fascism is that it's anti-individualistic. And of course, Dada was pro-individualistic, but there's that idea that a strong, unified government is much more important than the rights of an individual. Fascism did, something that we still see now. It played on people's fear of change and made extravagant, lies and claims about what the future could be. And of course, interestingly, fascism did attract some modernists. I know one that we talked about in my class, the German expressionist Emil Nolde joined the Nazi party very early in Germany. He joined in 1927 and remained a Nazi, even when his work was put in the Degenerate Art Show. But in general, most of the Dada artists, most of the modernists were appalled, whatever nation they were in, they were appalled by the rise of fascism. Here's a head of Mussolini, a very vain man, that was done by a sculptor named Bertelli. And you can see it was done in the round. It actually, when it was put out, I think they had one of these in the City Hall of Rome, or maybe there were mass casting mades for other city halls. You'd put it out there and you'd kind of get the feeling that Il Duce was present or watching you wherever you were. The Il Duce is everywhere. It's interesting that the style of Italian fascism really is a style that looks very, very familiar to us today. Some fascist buildings look a lot like a super Target. They look like big box stores. And the Museum of the Fascist Revolution had a new form of lettering that hadn't been used before. They had 3D lettering that went on top of this long, flat arch. And again, that's something you might see like at a modern mall. And the building had a metaphor of being a little bit factory-like, almost like it had, stacks built into it. And when you went inside, you might have seen, for example, this mural by Prampolini. And the theme of the mural is Mussolini's black shirts beating the communist demonstrators. So I wonder what Picasso thought of that, if you ever heard about that, that what Cubism got used for ultimately was a scene of black shirts beating the crap out of people. And it celebrated, you can see a fire in a building, explosions, kind of the excitement of violence as the red flag gets trampled, all in Cubist modernist style. The sculptor Marini made images of Italy in arms. Later was not fascist, but later in his career. But you can see he took kind of the imagery that you'd see in France from the Arc de Triomphe of an allegory of a flattened modernist woman leading Italy forward to a brighter future, allegedly. And some of the fascist architecture that still remains in Rome just looks absolutely stripped of culture. There was a kind of neoclassicism hitting brutalism where there's no detail, maybe some statuaries put into the arcs, and it was just it looked very, very artificial. One detail that Robert Hughes gives in his book, which I think is an incredible detail, he says that when Hitler came to visit Rome, when he came to visit Mussolini for the first time, Mussolini actually had fake apartment buildings like movie sets built on the road that Hitler was going to take from the airport. And then they hired actors and actresses to lean out the windows and wave handkerchiefs and wave at Hitler. So he had this whole kind of cardboard city made to make Rome look more modern than it actually was. In Germany, the plans for Hitler's architecture, for Nazi architecture, were so out of scale and so massive that many of them that could never be built. I think this one, I think the Berlin Dome was started, but there really wasn't enough steel or enough concrete in all of Germany, never mind in Europe, to actually make this Berlin Dome. But had it been built, if it had been possible to build it, it would have held 130,000 Nazi Party members for a Congress. And I don't know if you can see the tiny little white specks, but those would be people going up the stairs. But that's the essence of fascist architecture, is overwhelming scale that makes the individual feel the loss of their own importance. And there's a model of how it would have looked like a giant zit in the city of Berlin in Hitler's post-war vision. The one piece of that Speer design that really did get built was the reviewing stand at Nuremberg that you have probably seen in some of the chilling newsreels, 1/4 mile wide. It allowed political events and reviews where there was just tremendous rigor and order, with Hitler standing a little bit above everybody else to give his speeches. And to give you a feeling for kind of the before and after of Nuremberg and some other Nazi sites, I have one more short video of you that shows the fascist monuments, kind of a then and now video. We'll take a look at that, and then I think we'll have time for questions. Well, in a minute, I'll leave screen share, and I know you probably have some questions. We've got a lot to talk about, but just a promo that we'll be back on June 6th to talk about Russian modernism and constructivism. And with that, let me come back to everybody.